Thanks for listening to the Mornings with Carmen LaBerge podcast, made available thanks to support from listeners just like you.
Helping you wake up, remembering this is our Father's world. This is Mornings with Carmen LaBerge on Faith Radio.
If we're gonna fly, we fly like eagles, arms out wide. If we're gonna fear, we fear no evil. We will rise. By your power, we will go. By your spirit, we are bold. If we're gonna stand, we stand as giants. If we're gonna walk, we walk as lions.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. I received 4 invitations in the mail yesterday, like old-fashioned, in the mail with a stamp, hand-addressed invitations yesterday. Kind of fun. 2 baby showers, a wedding, and a graduation. 'Tis the season, right? Baby showers, weddings, graduations, invitations. There's actually only one of the 4 dates that I'm available, so I'm going to have to send my regrets to 3 of them. But I can respond to one of them by accepting the invitation. And responding really matters. So if you've been invited, it's important to respond. Responding matters to the host and the hostess. So you and I have received a very special invitation from Jesus. He has invited us into a relationship. He's saving us a seat. He has invited us to join him in a life that is real and full, to walk by faith and not by sight, to be yoked to him. He has invited us to be reborn to a living hope, to live with him forever in the Father's house, to walk with him and talk with him. Jesus has invited us to a wedding, yes, and to be his bride. It's an incredible invitation, right? One of the places where Jesus extends this invitation might not sound like the kind of invitation that you get to a baby shower or a wedding or a graduation. And it may not sound particularly personal until you stop to think about how well Jesus actually knows you. So before we open this invitation from Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 this morning, I want you to think about how you feel today. How do you feel today? Are you tired? Are you weary? Are you carrying a heavy burden? Could your soul use some rest? It almost doesn't matter how good life is going. All of those things are true at some level. Like the business and the busyness and even the good things of life wear us out and wear us down. So if you're tired or weary today, if you're carrying a heavy burden, if you could use some soul rest, you are not alone. And Jesus arrives with an invitation in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29. Jesus says, "Come to me. Come to me. I'm inviting you. Come to me. All of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you. I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls." The image here is the image of a rabbi, the way that we become yoked side by side, learning how to till the soil of the day, learning how to cultivate the culture of the day, learning how to walk faithfully, just as the rabbi walks step by step, at his pace, the pace of grace. Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you. I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls." My friend, the invitation has been sent, and the invitation stands. How will you respond today? Will you come to Jesus? Our friend Thann Bennett is going to join us next from the Equipped. You know him from The show, The Equipped, right here on the Faith Radio Network, airs on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Central. You can also listen to it as a podcast at myfaithradio.com. He also publishes the Equipped newsletter at theequippednewsletter.com, and he's going to join us next. Most importantly, I am looking forward to Thann telling us what's happening on his farm. So the Friday Farm Report from Thann Bennett's farm is going to lead off here. Word is, there is a bald eagle who is nesting with 2 baby eaglets, and those babies need to eat. And that eagle seems to think that Thann and his family have gathered ducklings for easy harvesting. So we're going to have a conversation about what to do when the magnificent and the legally protected is also the predator. Now, that's up next here on Mornings with Carmen. The kids have got to eat. That is what the eagle is thinking. The kids have got to eat. Thann Bennett is joining us this morning, first and foremost as a farmer. Hey, Thann.
Hey, Carmen. How are you?
Well, there's big excitement, I understand, on the Bennett farm. What is happening?
Oh, man. So, yeah, big excitement, but whether or not members of our family are excited or actually somewhat irate kind of depends.
Horrified?
Yeah. So, okay, so let me set it up this way. I work in sort of, one end of our barn that I finished off, and so I can see out kind of across the barnyard. And more than once every day right now, I see what looks like an airplane swoop in over that barn. I mean, just massive, Carmen. I mean, magnificent and massive, but also very, very much, as you set it up, a predator. This bald eagle, who is beautiful. She has 2 eaglets that are growing rapidly, but they're growing rapidly because they're trying to eat our barnyard animals. They're flying off specifically with our ducks, and I got to tell you, so it's a little humorous. It's a good nature lesson, but I'll go out and there will be one of our ducks that has been carried, a few hundred yards away, and then dropped because it's rather heavy, like scrambling back, bleeding, and then we have to. Now, here's the good news: all of them that have returned to us have recovered. But this is usually a time of new life, right? New chicks, new pigs, new even baby goats this year. This year, we are fending off eagles the size of airplanes. That's a slight exaggeration, but doesn't seem like it. It's a wild moment on the farm.
All right, let's just. I don't really have anything to say because that
leave
eagle
it there?
is protected. Well, there's nothing you can do. Like you are living out there on the edge of things, and this is what it's like. I mean, our threats have been hawks and bobcats, and we talk about the fact that chicken is on everybody's plate, and that's why every spring I feel like we have to get some new chickens because over the course of the past year, the chicken population has diminished. However, this year's been, I say a good year. The chickens are not maybe as happy as they've been in the past because there's a lot less free ranging than there used to be, but a lot more of them survive longer. So our chickens are now only free ranging when the chicken man, Matthew, is physically out there with him, with them, with his big stick.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe Matthew could have another tactic. I mean, maybe you could just buy ducks, and that would actually distract, the predators from the sky from going after your chickens. That might work too. But
hey,
do
ducks lay an egg every day like a chicken?
So not every day, but they do lay eggs. They lay big, hearty eggs, and they're very, very good for baking. So in lower numbers, but yes, they definitely lay eggs, and we have both hatched from them, and they're also breakfast from now and again.
All right, you and I might have to have an offline conversation about raising ducks because I might need to be
keep them away from the eagles.
All right. Yeah, well, let's talk about what is in the Equipped newsletter this week. Always leading off with the true.
Yeah, so I am going to be a little vulnerable here with the true, Carmen. I wrote the true out of a posture of having just prepared my taxes, okay? And it was just having just prepared my taxes after a year, my first year stepping away from a long-time employment. And so as I prepared my taxes and I saw the dramatically lower income from the year previous, I got to tell you, a lot of ego rose up in me. And I was looking inward at with a little bit of discontent at something that I didn't think should be there. And so it was from that posture that I just wanted to briefly read a quote here and just give a couple of thoughts. It's a quote from Henry Nouwen, his book, The Selfless Way of Christ. It says, "The great paradox which Scripture reveals to us is that real and total freedom is only found through downward mobility. The Word of God came down to us and lived among us as a slave. The divine way is indeed the downward way." And, Carmen, as I prepared my taxes, I was just reminded of that relentless drive in our society to make progress, right? To move up, to, graduate at the top of your class and get the best job, earn more this year than you did last year, maybe even some good pressures in there, right? To do more than you have previously for society. And I was feeling that after preparing my taxes. But then I kind of remembered through this quote that that's not what Jesus modeled for us. Jesus was the rightful heir to the throne of heaven. He had every right to simply press upward, assume his inheritance, assume his seat at the right hand of God. But he chose instead to mobilize downward for me. And it is actually in emulating that downward mobility of Christ that I have the opportunity to tap into some of that power that Jesus demonstrated through salvation for us. And so it's a very simple reminder this week leading off the Equipped, but really it's just, if you want your life to have a legacy that extends beyond your own power, if you want to emulate the downward mobility of Jesus Christ, then your life should be spent for those who are weak, for those who are down and out, and to resist this temptation to be constantly pressing upward in your own strength. And sort of the beautiful juxtaposition here, Carmen, if we do that, that's how you and I share in that inheritance that is the seat at the right hand of God alongside the one who provided salvation for us. And so it's only by mobilizing downward as Christ did that eventually that inheritance is realized in full. And so that's the truth for this week.
I'm visualizing this, like in that game where, there's always one less chair, and you're like all racing around to sit down at the chair, right? There's very little competition for the chair that's already out of the circle. It's the same.
That's
a
good.
whole lot less competition for the lower seat. Yeah. I'm really happy to be the doorkeeper in the house of the Lord. Like I am I like washing the dishes in the kitchen while everybody else is trying to be the most popular person at the table. So I like it. I mean, I like that. And I like the people who want to come to the kitchen and wash the dishes. Those are my people.
And Carmen, don't you think that takes the pressure off too? I mean,
absolutely.
If the invitation is to serve, like Christ served us, then when our expectations of how life should go or what we should have accomplished by now, they're gone. They're gone because we have offered to be a servant, like you said, the doorkeeper for Christ. And so really, no matter what happens, if we are serving, then the pressure is off.
It's a totally countercultural intuition, but it's the one that we learn from Jesus. And so thank you for that really, really important reminder today. All right, we are talking with Thann Bennett, author and host of The Equipped. Right now, we are on the Equipped newsletter at theequippednewsletter.com. We have talked about the true, which means that next up, we're going to look at what is going on in the world and bring the mind of Christ to bear. So stay tuned as we survey things like the Russian elections, and what's happening in Washington, D.C. in relationship to the United States of America and Israel. That's up next here on Mornings with Carmen. I'm Carmen LaBerge, host of Mornings with Carmen. Take a walk with Jesus today. Walk with him from the Last Supper in the upper room where he washed his disciples' feet
to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed with blood and sweat and tears. Walk with Jesus today as a man bound by Roman soldiers to trials and abuse, and walk with Jesus all the way to the cross. But expect always the unexpected and anticipate miracles, because there's a whole lot more happening than meets the eye when we walk with Jesus. Connecting faith to life. Faith Radio.
Continuing our conversation with Thann Bennett, host of The Equipped. We are looking at the Equipped newsletter at theequippednewsletter.com. All right, Thann, take us into some of the news of the week. Give us some perspective on the Russian election, which is really less of an election and more like a, affirmation of what's already happening.
Yeah, Carmen, your wonderful producer Paul was telling me that you had a conversation with Philip Yancey yesterday about sort of the last major transition that we saw in Russia as Boris Yeltsin left power and Vladimir Putin came to power. That began to happen right as we turned into the new century, December of 1999, actually. And good timing for that conversation, because Vladimir Putin is not only still in power, but he was just, I'm going to use air quotes here, he was just reelected again for another term of 6 years. And so, Carmen, if he finishes out that term, which runs through 2030, he will have served even longer than Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin served for 29 years in Russia. Maybe the one data point, though, that I think is really important for people to understand, even before we kind of get into the practical application for Jesus followers, nobody in the world believes that these were free and fair elections. There are a handful of Russian allies who will provide cover, but election observers all pretty much realize that the fix was in. The reported numbers are that 87% of a war-riddled population voted for Vladimir Putin. That is just not reality. And all of his opponents, by the way, stood up on the stage at the end and sort of unified behind him. And so this is a difficult one, I think, for us to interact with as Jesus followers. And so we just give a few reminders in the Equipped. First of all, the reminder from Galatians 5 that we were designed to live free, and that is something that is worth defending both in our own countries and abroad. And then next, Carmen, I think it's a good opportunity to realize that if you get too close to a situation, if you have too much proximity, you might not have the perspective that you need to identify the flaws in it. And so just inviting trusted Jesus followers into our lives so that iron can sharpen iron. And then maybe one very practical observation. We're heading into our own election season here in the United States, and we're actually well into it already. But I think this story is a good reminder that dissent and free debate is actually a hallmark of a free society, Carmen. If you don't have that, if you don't have the opportunity to air an opinion that is different to your governing authority, you don't have freedom. That's what happens in places like Russia, where the elections are fixed. So, you know me, I am constantly encouraging Jesus followers to engage in civil discourse and to actually work for common flourishing. But we're going to see a lot of different ideas over the next few months. And I think it will help us not be rooted in anxiety if we kind of juxtapose it against this story and realize that the evidence of different opinions and the freedom to air those, Carmen, that's actually a sign that our free society is working. And so I think that can relieve some of the anxiety in the months ahead.
We are months now into the war between Israel and Hamas. There are still more than 100 individuals who were taken hostage on October the 7th who are being held by the terrorist organization Hamas presumably in Gaza. Israel is committed not only to the recovery of those individuals, be they living or dead, but also the absolute eradication of Hamas, that it would never be a threat again to her sovereignty or her people. There is dramatic devastation across Gaza in the wake of Israel's war effort, and there is maybe a rising challenge being presented to Israel
even from the United States. And so Israel has announced its intention to enter Rafah, the most southern city in the Gaza Strip. Egypt continues to absolutely forbid people seeking to flee the war to cross their international border. And so there are a lot of people, a lot of civilians who find themselves in the way when the Israelis seek to ferret out the members of Hamas. All of that has led to a great deal of tension here in the United States, and so you address that. You talk about it as a chill in the air. Chuck Schumer, in particular, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, at the center of this controversy. He has now been talking behind closed doors with Republican members of Congress, and may receive an invitation to speak to Congress in person. Talk with us about your perspective on all of this.
So I continue to believe, Carmen, that this is the most important story in the world right now for Jesus followers to engage with and to understand and to view through the lens of Scripture. We use the terminology at the Equipped through the lens of the true and the beautiful. God's Word has so much to say about his relationship with the Jewish people. And so I really think this story for Jesus followers can only be fully understood, or at least adequately understood, if we view it through that lens. You're correct. The story that we talk about is a move that surprised a lot of people. The majority leader in the U.S. Senate, Chuck Schumer, went to the Senate floor and openly criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu. He actually called for new elections in Israel, and he called the Prime Minister an obstacle to peace. The Prime Minister then, sort of clapped back. He said that those comments were totally inappropriate. And he said if there was the establishment of a Palestinian state, it would be the greatest reward for terrorism in history. And so the thing that was surprising there, Carmen, is this is in a world of U.S. politics where everything is partisan. Support for Israel has, by and large, over the last several decades, been very bipartisan, almost no exceptions to that. And if there was a disagreement like this, typically that disagreement would have been taken behind closed doors and maybe shared with the prime minister in private, therefore to preserve the alliance. And so this public display of a difference of opinion was surprising. And so what we have been doing at the Equipped, and really what I encourage readers to do this week, is just to return almost without qualification to a set of guiding principles that we laid out through Scripture immediately following those attacks on October 7th. And one of the things that we try to do is build some muscle, some intellectual muscle in how we evaluate these stories. And these guiding principles, Carmen, they have tension in them. And I think some of that tension is laid out in the setup that you just put forward. I won't go through the whole rubric, but just very quickly, the four principles are that the Jewish people are God's chosen people. We find that very clearly in Scripture. They have faced persecution for thousands of years. The book of Esther is really about one of those very specific attempts to eradicate. Number two, every person, regardless of nationality or ideology, is made by the hands of God and bears the image of God. We find that in Genesis 1. Number three, authorities, including national authorities, Carmen, have a sacred duty to protect those within their charge. And I think this applies to the goals that you laid forward for Israel, to get their hostages back and to eradicate the threat to their people that very clearly exists and was played out on October 7th. And then number four, this relates very specifically to the story that we're talking about today. The actions of other world powers, especially the world superpower, the United States, those actions have an impact on these situations, especially when they involve terrorist organizations like Hamas. And so I would just tell you that that was kind of a long statement, but I think it's important because if you are looking at this story through just a U.S. Republican lens or just a U.S. Democrat lens or even just a pro-Israel or an Israel political lens, some of these points are not going to fit neatly into your narrative. But we want to be fully committed and dedicated to the lens of Scripture. And I think these four guiding principles, at least that's the framework that we're using, allow us to do that and allow us to sort of look in the mirror and maybe check some of our biases. But you're right. This is the most important story in the world for Jesus followers to understand. And this story, this division, this chill in the air, as I called it, this is something that we haven't really seen, at least to this level, in recent memory. And so I think this is a story really worth grappling with.
The other thing that you deal with this week in the Equipped is a change in home buying in the United States. And so I'm going to let you guys read that yourself at theequippednewsletter.com. You can sign up for it, and then you won't ever miss an issue. You can also listen to Thann talk about these and other issues as host of The Equipped. You can listen to it here on the Faith Radio Network live on Saturday afternoons at 4 p.m. Central, or via podcast at myfaithradio.com, or wherever you subscribe to your podcast, which, by the way, if you have your podcast service set up on Google, that is going away, like within a couple of days. And so you need to migrate your podcast to some other service if Google Podcasts has been your podcast provider, like it has been mine for a number of years. All right, Thann, as always, thank you so much. Good luck with the Ducks.
We need it. We'll keep an eye out for those airplanes disguised as eagles.
Exactly. All right, you guys already know this, but the clock is ticking on TikTok. Not just the United States legislature, but now the Germans as well are talking about banning TikTok. India already has a ban on TikTok. We could learn some lessons from India as we are looking here in the United States at TikTok. It's been interesting to see how people have responded to this as this conversation has been unfolding. And so we thought we would talk with Chris Martin, not only about his thoughts on the TikTok ban, but a range of other things going on in the culture today. I've been listening to a series of conversations about AI and all of the places in our lives where we are already, although we don't think about it very often, already totally reliant on AI and how it makes our lives, well, quote unquote, easier. But what are you paying for that? And you say, well, so much of it is free. Yeah, nothing is free. And so you are paying somehow in some way for that sense of convenience or that speed. So we're going to talk with Chris Martin about a number of things, including the terrible cost of a phone-based childhood. Yeah, where are your kids? Where are your grandkids? If they're on the phones, we want to talk about that. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. All right, we are thrilled to report that our brother Chris Martin is feeling better. So he's back. Chris, how you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing all right. How are you?
All right, I'm well. All right, I want to talk first about why you're so excited that people booed at a recent event. First of all, SXSW, is that South by Southwest?
It is. Yeah.
Look at me learning to read the weird letters. There you go.
Yeah. South by Southwest, if you don't know what South by Southwest is, that's okay. It's a annual sort of tech culture music get together. I feel like, I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people in this space would agree with me that South by Southwest really peaked in like the early 2000s or early 2010s maybe. When
I feel like it started out as like a thing in Austin where bands played.
Yeah, and that was like I think I'm not a South by Southwest historian, let me be clear, but I think that was much of the draw for a really long time, and it, like I said, it's like a confluence of music, culture, technology. It's always been a sort of gathering for that sort of thing, and so but it first came on my radar when I was like in high school in the early 2000s and then into the 2010s when really it felt to me like Silicon Valley took over this event that was once maybe more music focused and still is to some degree. But like Twitter debuted at South by Southwest 2007, I think, and a number of major tech companies, especially more social or culturally driven ones, have kind of stepped onto the main stage either literally on big stages at South by Southwest or in these like small fireside chat sort of gatherings where people get together and network and kind of quietly reveal these big new projects to each other. So there's no wonder then at South by Southwest this year, when it happened just a few weeks ago, I think the people started, the people in attendance, the attendees and the presenters were talking a lot about AI. And AI is the big hot thing right now. And I think there's plenty of evidence to show it will stick around longer than all of the chatter about maybe cryptocurrency or the metaverse did a few years ago. And so AI was a huge deal at South by Southwest this year. And Ted Gioia, who's a really great writer that I've started reading only recently, but has been writing for a long time on, frankly, South by Southwest is kind of his thing. He's a musician and music producer, but he also writes a lot about technology. And so South by Southwest is kind of right in his wheelhouse. And he wrote about how at South by Southwest, people started booing immediately when they were presented with the promise of AI. And I think that's really telling and really kind of cool. And I agree with Ted's assessment. He writes this. He says, if they were paying attention, they might already have a hunch. This is they being the AI promoters, you could say, the people who are promoting this technology. If the promoters of AI are paying attention, they might have already had a hunch at how much people hate this stuff. It's not just farmers in Kansas or your granny in Altoona, but hip progressive attendees at South by Southwest. These people literally come to the event to learn about new things, and they even they are gagging on this stuff. It's more than just fears about runaway AI. Prevailing attitudes about digital tech and innovation are changing rapidly in real time, and not for the better. The users feel used. And I've obviously written and spoken about that a good bit as it pertains to social media. But this is just kind of in line with another article I read this week from Axios and their AI column that comes out each week that I've been reading a lot of. The mega children's toy company Lego took some heat in the last week or so because they were found by some of their fans to have AI generated art for some of their new products, just as like promotional material. And they owned it. They said, yep, we this is AI generated. We went too far. We've been experimenting. We've been tinkering with AI and our creative. Thanks for holding us accountable. And, you know, it'll probably be no more than a blip on the PR radar for them. People aren't going to start throwing their Legos away because of it or anything like that. But it's very much a sort of egg on face moment for a lot of companies who make these sort of snafus right now. And in our work at Moody Publishers, we've been talking a lot about AI and its role in the kind of work we do and if it has a role at all. And I think a lot of folks, what's been encouraging to me about a lot of pushback against AI, I've been trying to kind of find a lowest common denominator of like, what are a lot of folks' biggest problem? Like, what's the biggest pushback? And in a lot of contexts, I think we see this with both the Lego example and how a lot of people responded to that last week, as well as the South by Southwest situation, is a lot of the pushback is kind of in favor of artists more than anything. It's like, if I could summarize it, it's, we don't like AI because it's just companies trying to be cheap and short circuit the creative process. And so that's why you have people booing it at South by Southwest. Gripes like that were some of the biggest comments that Lego were getting in response to their snafu in the last 10 days or so. What you have is you have $1 billion children's toy company like Lego, who could easily pay a graphic designer $300 to make a few promotional graphics for their new Lego Ninjago sets. But instead, they decide to throw a prompt into an AI tool, get something that's AI generated that their fans then sniff out and then cause a ruckus over. But, you know, hey, maybe they saved a few $100 or even $1,000 or something like that. And so I think what's encouraging to me is not just, there's not generalized anxiety where people are just like, oh, AI, it's bad. And they can't really articulate why. And it's just like, oh, AI, new must be bad. That would be kind of annoying because new isn't always bad. However, what has been encouraging to me is a lot of folks who are being very vocal about their opposition to AI integrating into some of these more creative spaces is that we're just taking the human out of the creative process, and that's not good, no matter how much money it saves for big companies. And I think that's a good line to take in this situation.
Right. I have been doing a little AI research for a conversation that I've been asked to have this summer, and just in terms of like, okay, how do we as regular people deal with this in terms of, there are now sites where you can have AI generate a sermon. You can have AI generate an obituary with empathy. You can have AI. I mean, so there are chatbots out there of all kinds doing all kinds of things. And obviously they are using AI to do that. So we're just talking about machine learning. We're talking about generative AI when we're talking about it moving beyond what it has gathered out there from what's already on the internet, and then pressing that forward into what it thinks the next word would be or the next storyline would be. And so when you think about AI, maybe that is a way to be thinking about it. Chatbots are giving spiritual advice. That's concerning to me. Like, right, when you take the human being out of, let's say, the grief process, or you take the human being out of the Bible study process, or the sermon process, the sermon preparation process, I become concerned. And so you and I both read a piece in Scientific American about chatbots giving spiritual advice. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, this piece was really interesting. I think, I'm not sure that, addressing what do we think about chatbots giving spiritual advice? Well, on its face, that seems pretty foolish, right? Like, come on, that seems really foolish. At the same time, I think, I read some of the examples in the article of that go a little bit beyond the headline and beyond that top line question of, hey, someone's taking the entire works of Augustine and putting them into a sort of chatbot so that you could engage, by chatting with that chatbot, you could be chatting with Augustine, if you will, or other church leaders of yore and long ago in church history. And what if we could get the chatbot of Augustine and the chatbot of, someone else to speak with each other and debate or whatever else? That's interesting. Cool. The problem is, the practical problem is you're still going to need a human to kind of verify that, would Augustine have really said that, or would the other person have really have said that, as if they're debating each other? It's not like this stuff just like runs on its own and can be, wholly trusted on its own or anything like that. However, I think that kind of thing is kind of interesting, generally speaking. Like, oh, that's a cool creative use of technology. Like if you don't have the time or ability to read everything Augustine's ever wrote, but you want to ask the chatbot what's Augustine's view on Trinitarian theology, and there comes to a point where you believe you can get a pretty reliable answer, what difference is that from Googling it? There is no difference, really. It's just a Google search engine specifically for what Augustine thought about things. So it's some of these applications that are even cited in the article aren't too dissimilar from what we're already doing with like a Google search engine. Where I think it gets weird is when we start using it for like personal spiritual guidance. Do I doubt that chatbots have the ability to give some semblance of like something that is a facsimile of personal spiritual guidance? No, I don't doubt that they could produce some kind of text that someone could interpret as personal spiritual guidance. Do I think that that's wise or practically as helpful as talking to someone else? No, absolutely not. And so this is where I think we start to, one of the big debates that we've kind of had, even at Moody Publishers, just pulling back the curtain on our process a little bit, is even like, okay, set aside for a second, like, is this application of AI right or wrong, like morally or ethically speaking? Let's ask for a second if this is even practical, right? Like, because a lot of folks are just trying to figure out a way to shoehorn this into like so many aspects of life that sometimes you just have to step back and say like, okay, before we even debate whether or not it's quote unquote right to do this, does it make sense? Like, does it save us time? Does it save us energy? Does it save us money or whatever else? And if the answer is no to that, well, then you don't even have to get to the practical or ethical because it's just, or the ethical or moral, because it's not practical. And so I think from a sort of practical perspective, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to seek spiritual guidance from a chatbot, because then you're going to have to like wonder, is this legit? Should I be listening to this? Should I not be? You start to wonder so many other things that may just kind of like kneecap the effectiveness of the chatbot to begin with. However, I'm not saying this won't be popular, because as we're seeing more and more, people are seeking guidance from, spiritual guidance from Google more than they're seeking spiritual guidance from their parent or from their pastor. And so I don't doubt that some people will be attracted to things like this, that, chatbots that can give spiritual guidance. I just don't think we have any reason to pursue them personally. And I think if they grow in popularity and interest, it's yet another sort of checkpoint on the road of dissociating the person from the spiritual experience, which I think is just happening in a lot of areas in Christian life today.
That's a good bridge to a conversation that I want to have with you about a piece by Jonathan Haidt in The Atlantic. End the phone-based childhood now. The environment in which kids grow up today is hostile to human development. I think that these conversations are connected. Like, where do we turn first? And if we turn first to our phones, instead of to our family or faith figures or teachers, like actual counselors, then we have a real problem. Kids aren't even turning to their friends necessarily; they're turning literally to their phones. And so we want to have that conversation. We got to take a very brief break. We're talking with Chris Martin. He is an expert in the field of social media. It is his native habitat, unlike some of the rest of us. And so we're going to talk with him about how teens and parents approach screen time and the terrible cost of phone-based childhood. That's up next here on Mornings with Carmen. 150 million people actively use one particular app every month in the United States of America. I want that to be the Faith Radio app. How about you? If you're wondering how you could be encouraged in your faith at any time, anywhere, well, I got good news for you. There's literally an app for that. You can listen to Faith Radio live, any show on demand, no matter where you are at any time of the day or night. Download the free Faith Radio app right now. It's super easy. Just text the word app to 877-933-2484 and click the link. Let's connect faith to life. All right, what has gone wrong? It doesn't take long to look around and recognize that young adults and teenagers in America are really, really struggling. We're not just talking about loneliness and friendlessness. We're not just talking about mental health and anxiety. We're talking about basic scores in reading and math. We're talking about dating less, and we're talking about less interest in actually getting jobs or driving. And so we want to talk about what has happened and maybe how to reverse the trend. So we're talking with Chris Martin. Chris, you and I both read a piece in The Atlantic by Jonathan Haidt. We're talking about the terrible cost of phone-based childhood. What's the bottom line?
Yeah, bottom line, man, hard to summarize. It's a really long article that I assume is either an excerpt of his upcoming book or related to his upcoming book. I wasn't sure, but Jonathan Haidt knocks it out of the park again, and he just talks about at length how phone-based childhoods and teenage years, obviously teens are still children, has really it's the culprit. It basically the bottom line is it's the phones. It's the phones. It's the phones. It's the phones. And I think for so long, for too long, we've accepted this sort of thing as like phones are just neutral, or social media is just neutral, and it's teens who use it wrongly or teens who use them too much that ultimately are the culprit. And I think that's an understandable perspective, and I think it's a definitively wrong perspective. I think it's important to know that it is the phones. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have agency and we can't own our own activity, but I think we have to, by Haidt's leadership and others, recognize just how pervasive these technologies are, and that a lot of teens who might have unhealthy relationships with their phones, that those unhealthy relationships with their phones were kind of initiated by their parents. And so in some ways, these teens are being given access to a piece of technology. They don't, unfettered access to a piece of technology. They don't have the maturity to mediate themselves, and frankly, their parents may not have the maturity to mediate themselves. And so he talks about techno-optimism and the birth of phone-based childhood. I think there's so much ill that kind of happened in the early iPhone years when a lot of parents, frankly, just didn't recognize what giving a kid unfettered access to a phone connected to the internet at all times of day would do. And so I think anybody should go and read that Atlantic article. It's really long. Set aside some time, grab a cup of coffee, and start to ask some serious questions about is it my kid being irresponsible, or maybe is there maybe some ownership more in the phone and the technology itself that maybe I shouldn't blame my kid all the time or those teens and their phones. Maybe it is the phone itself a little bit more than we'd like to admit, and there's steps that we can take to help our young people have more healthy relationships with their phones, which frankly is probably results in starting their relationship with them a bit later than we have been.
I feel like the Guardian, who wrote this up as a pocket full of poison, could have made a nod in the direction of the wolf in their pockets.
Yeah, for real. That's a good one. Yeah.
There's a lot of coverage actually on Haidt's forthcoming book. It's The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And yes, the piece in the Atlantic is basically a digest of what he's going to cover in the book, which I think the street date is later this week, so or over the weekend. Hey, as always, thank you so much. There's always more content than we can cover, but it is really helpful to have a conversation with a person who's thinking from a biblical worldview, from a Christian perspective about the things that we're encountering every day in real life. So we really appreciate you. Thank you so much, Chris.
Of course. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. All right, that's Chris Martin. What are you struggling with your family, with your kids? Like, what is do you have a challenge of getting them off their phones? I have a challenge of getting Matthew off of his gaming device, right? So they enter into these worlds that are very visually rich and very exciting and engaging their minds and engaging their hearts. And so are you having a challenge? You having a challenge with your kids, maybe with your grandkids? Maybe you are trying to plan for Vacation Bible School or some kind of engagement with kids in your community, and you're like, they just want to be on their phones. How do we get them not only to come to something, but how to put their phones down while they are participating in something? Like, those are very real challenges today. And so how can we use what's out there effectively? And how can we help wean them off of something upon which they have become totally dependent that's actually really unhealthy, not just mentally, but spiritually and physically as well. So there you go. Love your thoughts on that. The text line's open, 877-933-2484. And yes, for those of you asking, I can absolutely send you the link, not only to the piece in the Atlantic, but a couple of other places where Jonathan Haidt's content is covered and wouldn't be behind a paywall. So, yes, text me, 877-933-2484. Happy to send you those links. We got another hour together up next. Yes, we're going to have a Friday Farm Report, and we're also going to talk about the movies. Thanks for listening to Mornings with Carmen LaBerge. Podcasts like this are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes to give now. And thanks.